The smell of pitch-black mold and moss hit my nose like a hard blow, and the trees kept reminding me of the bony, gnarled fingers of some old witch. The sky hung like a heavy shroud, and the wind howled louder than any beast tearing leaves from the trees like flesh from a victim. The only thing missing from this gloomy place was a terrible creature that was ready to devour you at any moment and in any place. Eugene was drooling, and his strength was already running out since he had already spent a huge part of it on plunging his sword into the monster, and there was nothing left to do except hold on and curse at the wild creature. Judging by the roar that erupted from the monster, the sword strike was not enough for it, and it wanted to devour its victim so much that the blood pouring from the deep wound was not an obstacle. As a result, the hero's head ended up in the monster's mouth, and Eugene woke up from such a realistic dream, dying on the other end of reality. Touching his neck to see if his head was still in place, the guy was drenched in cold sweat and breathing heavily, not so much from the nightmare as from the fact that this condition had been going on for 20 years straight. It all started from the moment when Eugene experienced pain, as if he was really dying, but in the end he simply woke up. The street was bustling with life, while a man with a constant headache in every sense of the word sat at home and couldn't really go out. The only good thing about Eugene's dreams was that he recognized new monsters and was already somewhat trained in fighting them. Having completed a new entry in the diary, the fighter got up from the table with the thought that he could withstand any pain instead of finding himself in a very realistic dream again. The room looked as if no one had lived in it for a long time, and the guy moved around it with difficulty, trying to collect his thoughts. But the only thing that came into Eugene's head was the desire to get a good night's sleep, because for so many years he had to endure death in his sleep, and the pain that followed had left him terribly tired. Falling asleep in reality, the fighter returned to the world of nightmares where he was killed, and he returned to himself in ordinary life, and so on, circle after circle. It was already difficult to count how many and in what variety of ways the hero died, and this was even more tiring because it seemed like he had already learned to fight, but it was useless. Normal people felt tired and wanted to sleep from some ordinary things, and Eugene could no longer remember the last time he slept like that normal person. With each awakening after a fake death, it became more and more difficult, and death in real life became much closer. Eugene spent 12 years doing everything possible to avoid dying when attacked by terrible creatures. But each time the hero met another monster, it was like the first time, and his veins trembled and his blood turned cold. The guy began to die less in his dreams thanks to the efforts he made, but he didn't feel any calmer. Eugene felt so bad that the line between sleep and reality was rapidly erased and became thinner. Sleep should have brought rest and recharge, but in Eugene's case it was a global problem. The doctors were powerless to help the patient and anxiously tried to say something like, "Find something you want to do," and then there would supposedly be no problems with sleep. It was difficult for Eugene to think about something elementary, let alone hobbies or even simple everyday things. The man found himself in an endless damned circle where his only desire was to get some sleep, and when he tries to do this, he only gets more suffering. The guy just wanted to sleep like he once did, at least once more, and he didn't need more. After his words, or maybe even prayers, Eugene felt a surprisingly warm blood flow from his nose, which flowed in such a stream as never before in his dreams. The body became practically weightless, and the guy looked at his hand, which was also already covered in blood, but his legs did not obey because the brain did not trigger panic or any reaction at all. Weakness was stronger than any weapon, and all Eugene managed to say before he fell was, "What the hell?" There was already a decent-sized pool of blood on the floor, into which the guy fell like a dead weight, and that was his last movement. The cold gaze froze in one spot, and the last thoughts about what was happening flew out of the mouth with the last breath. It would seem that there should be either nothing or pain, but Eugene felt what he asked for, and this was lightness in the body, and even the headache stopped and fresh air filled the lungs, and it was the feeling of that very cherished desire to get enough sleep. Eugene opened his eyes slightly and immediately recognized the painfully familiar sky and asked out loud not to tell him that he had died after all. When his eyes opened completely, the hero's other senses became heightened, and he couldn't confuse the smell of moss, the feeling of thick fog, and the terribly uncomfortable texture of the wood under his back with anything else. The guy felt more cheerful when he realized that he was again in the same world he had been in for 12 years in a row. There was no time to relax and no time to think either, because the cracking of branches and loud footsteps from the side indicated the approach of danger. A creepy lizard, far from earthly in size and realistic, with a ton of eyes, was just scurrying around the forest in search of a tasty meal. The creature quickly caught the scent of warm flesh and stuck out its tongue to better sense the direction of its victim. His brain finally started working, and Eugene tried to analyze the possible moment that the lost amount of blood in the real world could actually lead to death. The situation was extremely shitty because now essentially if Eugene wasn't in the real world, then if he died in this damn dream, he wouldn't be anywhere at all. And since there was nowhere else to return to, the guy decided to take everything possible from his existence. Acutely feeling that his dream had now become reality, Eugene felt as if he had been born a second time. The hero, not hiding from the monster but rather attracting its attention, did so with the clear understanding that he had seen this place so many times that he knew by heart what needed to be done to survive. The guy took into account another option of what he could do, and that was not to engage in battle but to go to a bright place where monsters do not poke around. But for some reason Eugene stopped from the persistent feeling of going to the creature and killing it. It was as if his hand itself was reaching for the sword, and the hero could not yet explain to himself what he was about to do, but he was also powerless to stop it. For the first time Eugene didn't want to run away, and his legs were surprisingly strong like springs. And when the lizard noticed its prey, the adrenaline only added spice to the fighter's intentions. The first thing the hero thought about was that he was overflowing with energy from the fact that he had finally slept, but the thought that his body was much younger also did not give him peace. The huge monster, like an armored train, rushed towards the tasty meat at high speed, while Eugene already knew what he wanted to do with the monster. Again, the mouth was full of sharp teeth and saliva, but the hero's sensations from the encounter with the monster were completely different. In strong hands, the sword rose as confidently as never before, and at the same time the body remained light. The only thing the new shell screamed to its owner was that it wanted to fight so that blood would splatter. The ringing sound of metal mingled with the roar of the beast and the cutting of heavy flesh and bones. Eugene's desire to survive was as strong as the lizard's desire to feast on his flesh. The monster no longer moved but simply dragged itself along the ground like a dead weight, by inertia raising dust behind it. Not only was Eugene able to gut the creature along its entire body, he also grabbed its tail, and in the end in one fell swoop shook the blood off the sword. It seemed that even the sky itself indicated victory to the hero, as the thick clouds were pierced by the rays of the sun, as the sword pierced the creature's body. Eugene walked up to the dead monster and thrust his sword in again, even though there was no need for it. But the hero made movements with the sword not just for the sake of it, but in order to get what had previously been unattainable for him. In the guy's hand was something like a lizard egg that glowed unusually from the inside, showing that it was alive, but in fact it was the essence of the monster which contained its power. For the first time Eugene didn't die but made someone die in this damned world, and he didn't stop at a large individual. Greedily biting into the egg-like structure, the hero wanted to feel his victory by absorbing new strength. It seemed that the wind howled even more ferociously than in other moments of the hero's battle, but at the same time it was the wind of freedom. Eugene looked up at the sky and remembered that he had another option of what he could do besides fighting the monster. Having hidden the sword, the guy nevertheless went to a place that was much lighter and therefore safer, because he needed to think everything through carefully. Fortunately, there were a lot of places where the sun was shining brightly, and you just had to get to the nearest one. The hero's step was confident, and his body was strong and obedient, as if he was no longer fighting against himself, but on the contrary had become his own ally. Despite the vertical resting position, Eugene settled quite comfortably on a tree branch, hugging his sword. Being at a height, the guy was not whipped by the wind as much as below due to the dense crowns of the trees, but the noise of the leaves did not irritate him either. With his eyes closed, Eugene felt much more in the world of monsters than when he was here, like in a dream. A soft smile froze on the fighter's face from the fact that even standing in a tree, he could still sleep much better than in a bed in the real world. Thus the guy experienced another night of perfect sleep, thanks to which his body was filled with energy for new achievements. The sky was not always sunny even in places, but on the contrary it could become much thicker due to the clouds, and the wind also increased. Eugene noted the number of days that had passed since he entered the fantasy world, and a month had already passed. The most important task for the hero was to go from pitch darkness to light and control his desire to fight, since it did not always mean going on a hunt. Although he was a fairly strong fighter, Eugene still continued to act on the principle that risking one's life for fun was madness, if not downright insanity. Watching from the side as the creatures devoured their own kind to satisfy their hunger, the hero did not understand why his desire to fight was so strong. And when he saw how greedily the creature was gnawing at the flesh of another monster, Eugene realized that he would only go hunting when he needed food, and that was the moment when he was hungry. Attacking from behind, the guy easily cut off the head of a creature that looked very much like a huge bat. The hunter didn't just kill creatures but looked for that very essence in order to replenish his strength and gain new ones. To some extent Eugene already missed the usual tasty food, but when there is no fish, even crayfish is fish, especially with such a filling. Eating not particularly tasty food gave the hero at least the opportunity to gain the strength of a monster, which meant increasing his combat skills for fighting others. The fighter also noted that by consuming essences he found it easier to adapt to his new habitat, making his life much easier. In addition, the guy discovered in the things that were on the new body something that could mean a lot about the previous owner. Eugene often looked at the previous owner's badge, which indicated his status as a third-class mercenary, which also meant that he could read local inscriptions. The image on the token depicted 3 deep scratches similar to those that the local creatures left on Eugene's body in every dream. What amazed the hero even more was the possible presence of people in this world, since monsters would definitely not have created something like this. For now, the guy looked away from the important artifact because he noticed the light towards which he always needed to head. In such moments of the glowing forest, the fighter felt more alive than ever before in his life. Since Eugene had the body of a fairly strong mercenary, he noticed something dangerous among the dense thickets of the forest, but not an animal. The hero's discovery was mortally dangerous, but at the same time it also pointed to his recent suspicions about the presence of people in a fantasy world. Never before had the boy been so happy about a trap that sparkled brighter than drops of water in the sun. Eugene was shocked and happy at the same time, so all that was left was to check the place where the chain led. The hero ran as fast as he could towards the possible place of residence of a person like him. The sun was no longer just shining but was blinding his eyes, as if telling the fighter that he was in the right direction. Eugene froze in the middle of the clearing when he saw a wooden house and couldn't believe his luck, having essentially fallen into a trap. Fortunately, a month of living in the trees did not affect the hunter's civilization, but his surprise was endless. The hero knocked and entered, asking if anyone was there and apologizing in advance if he had disturbed anyone. The first thing that caught the fighter's eye was a book on the table, which aroused the keen interest of someone who wanted to get to know this world better. Thanks to his ability to read fantastic hieroglyphs, the boy recognized that in front of him was the chronicles of the demonic world. So greedily Eugene dug his hands only into the essence that he took from the dead bodies of creatures, and now it was a book. The hunter's eyes grew wider and wider in surprise at the place in which he now lived, as if it were reality. The book described in some detail the history of the world and the terms used to explain various facts. The guy's eyes lit up with a desire to study the manuscript because for him it was like a guide to the world in which he was clearly stuck for a long time, and plus it had a high chance of survival. Since the door was open, Eugene woke up when he heard a loud and strong step on the wooden floor. The old man immediately greeted the stranger with a loaded bow, but still decided to ask who dared to brazenly enter someone else's house. The guy didn't make any sudden moves and didn't even finish reading the book, but he realized that an acquaintance couldn't be avoided, since he was looking for people himself, so there was no point in ruining the first meeting. A rather stern man asked to answer to the point, otherwise he would be ready to blow a hole in your head. Eugene was glad to see someone like himself, but the fact that he was mistaken for a robber spoke of the local residents' serious intentions. The fighter raised his hands and began to explain that he did not want problems or to be misunderstood, but in this wilderness there was not a single soul, so he entered the house only out of curiosity. The old man warned the young man to get out of his territory, as he had no business with the stranger. Eugene answered the hunter that he understood, but then glanced sideways at the book, realizing that he would not leave without it. Placing his hand on the valuable manuscript, the stranger tried to calmly begin the conversation in which he wanted to reach an agreement. The guy asked if the gentleman could lend him a book, and even if he had to pay for it, money was no problem. The old man asked point-blank what would happen if he refused the stranger's request, since he had every right to do so while on his own territory. Eugene understood the resident's mood, but he also needed the manuscript to increase his survival rate. The hand lay on the sword, and the metal rang loudly in the complete silence, but the bowstring and arrow creaked against it. The fighter also decided not to give up and told the old man that in that case he would really have to become a robber. Both hunters kept their eyes on each other in order to intercept the attack, and the situation became increasingly tense. Considering how gray the local old man already was, he had clearly seen more than the young guy, so not a single muscle on his face moved when the stranger drew his sword. Eugene in turn did not know how strong the old man was, but he did not intend to lose so quickly. The next moment the old man exhaled heavily, making it clear with such a sign that he was definitely not going to fight. The old man admitted that the robber would definitely not ask to borrow the book, and immediately said that he was pleased to meet him and introduced himself as Hector. Eugene felt uneasy that the hunter had so easily let his guard down, but he also introduced himself as Kim Eugene. The old man heard the boy's name as Gamuji and said that it was a rather unusual name, so he asked to call him simply Gene. For the first time, the hero felt awkward because his name was clearly difficult to pronounce in these parts. Hector understood what Gene was talking about the book, but it was expensive and therefore he couldn't lend it to him, but the guy could read it if he stayed in the house for a while. The hunter said that in return he asked the young man to help with the housework, and Eugene happily agreed and thanked him for the opportunity. A thick fog was spreading around the house, but even so it was much more pleasant to be in this place than in the dense thickets of the forest or on a tree branch, especially when the inside of the house smelled of freshly cooked soup that was being cooked over a fire. It reminded the soldier so strongly of his home. In Gene's opinion, Hector was rather abrupt and rude, but at the same time he was not a bad person at his core. Kim looked at the bowl of soup and couldn't believe that for the first time in a long time he would eat such familiar food, and even hot. After the first spoonful of this simple but terribly delicious soup, it seemed to the guy that Hector had appeared in his life like an angel. At sunrise, the old man went hunting, and once again Kim asked how long he was going to be gone, to which the old man warned that today's trip might take longer. As it turned out, the hunter had always devoted himself to taking revenge on the monster that killed his comrades. For a guy, the old man looked like a pretty strong and experienced hunter, so seeing him nervous was somehow strange. The only conclusion Kim came to was that the monster the old man was hunting was clearly powerful. Left alone with himself, Gene read the chronicles as agreed with the owner of the house. So the guy learned that all stories originate from the Northern Empire, but not as something noble and great. Unfortunately, the king of the Northern Empire was blinded by greed for power and thus reached the otherworldly gates, which were a dangerous prohibition for everyone. According to those who knew the truth of all things, an immense power were hidden in the gates, and when you are driven by greed for world domination, you will do everything to become the greatest. On the day the king opened the gates, disasters began that humanity is still struggling with to this day. Powerful monsters emerged from the otherworldly gates, and in just 9 years turned the North into a demonic world. People were not ordinary creatures either, so humanity united many factions to create the Alliance of Order, which erected a barrier to stop the spread of evil. As the barrier was being erected, the book slammed shut as the newly arrived hunter needed to digest the information. The guy's expectations were confirmed, and the manuscript really turned out to be a treasure trove of useful information. Kim began to draw parallels with what he had heard, that the deeper you go into the demonic world, the stronger the creatures will be, and it really turned out that the further he went towards the light, the monsters became weaker. While Gene was raging with analysis in his head, the hunter quickly returned home, and not with the best news. Kim became so interested in finding out how deep he had already been in the demonic world that he didn't even pay attention to the approaching footsteps. Hector had no time to think because his life was at stake, and this time he was in big trouble. While a pack of werewolves led by the leader was chasing the old hunter, Gene kept thinking about how strong he was in this world. The old man ran with all his might, realizing that he was in deep trouble and that he couldn't save himself with just a bow. The werewolves rushed after their victims like a hurricane, in which the sounds of growling, chattering teeth, and heavy quick steps were mixed. When the distance was at least a little sufficient, Hector decided to turn everything around so as to strike head-on, but he had to act quickly. The hunter had already lived a long life and fired several arrows at once, realizing that one would not make a difference to him. But the leader scattered the arrows to the sides as if they were toothpicks and continued to approach the victim. Hector officially admitted that he was in deep shit and tried to at least run away to avoid being eaten. The old man ran towards the house, while Gene, on the contrary, came out of hiding with his sword at the ready. Kim twirled the weapon in his hand so that the creatures would pay attention to the ringing of metal and leave the hunter alone. Hector, in a panic, asked the guy to run away from here or at least hide in the house because he was going into the clutches of death, but he did not answer. On the contrary, while the old man was running towards the shelter, the young man ran to the opposite side of the clearing, straight into the teeth of the werewolves, which caught the old man off guard. The old hunter didn't even have time to say anything to the guy, who flew past like the wind, preparing for the worst. All that Hector remembered about the young man was his blood-red eyes that looked clearly at the creature that needed to be killed. Kim decided to attack from above this time, so he made one precise jump towards the leader of the pack. The monster had already prepared its dagger-sharp claws to cut the biped's body into small pieces. The werewolf hurried, raising his paw up, thinking that the two-legged creature would immediately die from the collision with the claws. But the hellhound faced a fate similar to that of the lizard that Kim killed first when he entered the fantasy world. For another moment, the werewolf stood frozen with the lady on top, but the body was no longer under his control. The leader's relatives growled in bewilderment at what was happening to the leader, who suddenly fell to his knees. When the flesh split into two parts and fell flat on the ground, the pack growled menacingly, preparing to avenge the leader. Hector stood in shock after seeing what a guy who simply asked to read a book was capable of. In the end, Jean killed the werewolf with one blow, something the old hunter had never seen before. The wolf lay in a pool of its own blood, and its body was cut open from the paw with which it had reached for the hunter and along its entire back. The poor fellow flinched when he heard the young man call his name to find out something. Eugene became curious whether the monster he killed was considered strong, and if so, whether there was anyone stronger. Hector's face darkened from the fact that it turned out that he didn't know at all who he had sheltered in his house, and at the same time he couldn't drive away such a strong person, so he rhythmically repeated the guy's question, "Is the werewolf strong?" The old man replied that the monster was not just strong but worse than other demons because of its agility and ferocity, so it was very significant that the young man dealt with it so easily. Jean was satisfied with how the hunter reacted to his battle with the demon, and the old man's answer was also exhaustive. Turning to the pack of equally hungry and bloodthirsty wolf-like creatures, Kim told Hector that he would be happy to hear the details after he dealt with the others. The monsters were still aggressive towards the two-legged creature, especially after the death of the leader, but no one attacked first, which means they were not stupid and thirsty only for blood. Eugene roughly estimated that there were about 40 monsters and realized that if he let his guard down for even a second, he would be finished, even though the pack, unlike the leader, did not look so strong. The hunter realized that, in order to disperse the fighting spirit, it was necessary to kill the next most important monster. Finding a werewolf that looked different from the rest of the pack wasn't difficult, and the guy focused his gaze on him. A particularly large individual with a different color than the other monsters stood in front, which meant it was the next victim for the mercenary. Kim braced himself for the blow and showed with his entire aura that he had no intention of retreating or sparing anyone. Although the werewolf was standing in front of a human, his gaze was much worse than that of any wild animal, considering how much he had been through and experienced. For some unknown reason, the werewolf whined like a dog and lowered his gaze to the ground, and his eyes suddenly stopped shining with a blue flame. How the faces of the other monsters changed when they saw that the second most important leader simply turned around to leave and would not attack. The red-haired offspring rushed so fast that the rest of his relatives were almost blown away by the wind, and it was surprising that his heels did not catch fire. The wolf, with his mouth wide open, said something to the others in his dog language, and it looked like they should also run away if they didn't want to die. One of the werewolves was shocked by what he heard and even closed his mouth, realizing that there was nothing more to ask and it was better to listen to the one who clearly saw more than they did. The dogs waited for another moment, hoping that something would change, but the replacement leader had no intention of returning. Kim lowered his sword when he saw that the whole pack had run off after the strange red-haired friend and were looking back at him rather strangely. Hector no longer knew how to react to the fact that the wolves, known for their bravery and ferocity, ran away from just one look of the guy. Eugene thought that the red dog definitely knew how to assess the situation he found himself in and therefore did not get into a dangerous situation. The wolf himself had his own views, which only he could know, regarding the strong and strange stranger who killed their leader. Thanks to the fact that Hector took the risk of letting a stranger into his house, he will be able to live in the old shack a little longer, but he could have died today. The old man told the boy that for such a capture as the leader of the wolves, they would give at least 40 gold coins, and that was the reward for his head, and there was also the skin and meat. While the monster's skin lay on the table like a trophy, Kim asked if these 40 coins were a lot of money, and the hunter nodded in confirmation. The mercenary was shocked when he heard that for the money the old man spoke of, one could live comfortably and not work for about 6 or even 7 years. Eugene was also surprised by the price for such a weak monster, which he killed without any difficulty, although he had already encountered various creatures that were much stronger. The thought of rewards in the form of money prompted Eugene to think that the bigger and stronger the demon, the more he would receive, and this couldn't help but make him smile. The guy's spirits were so lifted by the fact that he would essentially just have to kill monsters and rake in the money for it that he was already determined to go and complete tasks, and for the first time it seemed like life had become better than the previous 12 years. Hector placed many different objects on the wolf skin which Kim had questions about. The young man started with the simplest question about what the hunter had brought, and he began to tell him about the things that would be useful to him on the road. The old man asked the young man to take everything he saw in front of him and go to the village of pioneers to the place marked on the map and then find Jacob. Having rolled the skin into a convenient bundle, Hector explained that it was Jacob who would buy such prey at a good price, to which the boy asked if the old man was sure that he could simply give away something so valuable to him. Hector made it clear to the mercenary that he had killed the one whom the hunter himself had been trying to catch for years, and now he was simply paying tribute, especially since he had a score to settle with this wolf. The elder extended his hand to the young man, once again showing his attitude towards him. The hunter thanked the guy for avenging him and also saving him, and expressed his hope that they would see each other again. Kim firmly shook the hand of the man who had also done a lot for him, and it was not about the opportunity to read a book or eat warm soup, but first and foremost in a human way. Feeling respect for his elder, Eugene also thanked him for everything he did for him. Almost nothing has changed in the clearing where the house stood, except that you can no longer hear conversations in the evenings. The hunters nodded to each other in farewell, and Kim set off on his way, now with everything he needed to safely reach the village. Ahead again was the road and the thick forest, but for the newly chosen mercenary it felt completely different. The surprising thing was that from a high cliff a red wolf was watching his enemy, who now also wanted to take revenge. The werewolf sat silently on the edge of the stone ledge and watched the direction of the victim. Without taking his eyes off the stranger, the werewolf growled menacingly, as if he was waiting with all his might for the moment to attack the leader's killer and tear him to pieces. Kim didn't walk for very long, as he quickly reached the gates of that very village and already understood who he needed to approach. The adventure in the fantasy world had just begun, and interest was welling up in the young hunter's chest. Approaching the guard at the village gate, Eugene had already realized that for a small town the place was well supplied. It was quite expected for the guy that all the local residents would look at him as if he were an obvious uninvited guest. Even if the men were just local residents, their habits were no different from bandits, but Kim didn't give a damn. The hunter felt the tension in the air due to his appearance and the fact that everyone was on guard, but he still continued to go to the place he needed. One thing was clear to the man who had recently arrived in these parts: the world of people was even more dangerous than the creatures that lived in the forest. After all, a monster has only one intention towards a person, and this is easy to read, but people are vile and can attack from behind under the guise of peaceful intentions. Kim got his bearings well and quickly found the sign he needed. The first thing that happened when Eugene found himself inside the establishment was that he was hit in the nose by so many smells that it was enough to drive him crazy, and the second thing was the noise from all sides. When you've been in the forest for a long time and gotten used to the natural environment, human screams become very annoying to hear, so the guy simply continued moving towards the stand. Eugene was finally able to take off some of his clothes and place them right on the counter, after which the bartender immediately asked if the guy wanted a beer. The hunter immediately indicated that he was not interested in drinking and asked to be told where he could find a certain Jacob. The bartender immediately turned in the right direction, especially since the person the mercenary needed was sitting nearby, and immediately responded to his name. The man, while eating, introduced himself as Jacob and asked how he could help, but Gene noticed from his face that he was clearly a swindler. The guy explained that he came from Hector because he said that Jacob would be the one who could buy the werewolf skin. Before the mercenary could finish speaking, Jacob jumped off his chair and threw everything he had out of his hands, shouting that he didn't believe that Hector had finally managed to kill that wolf. Kim did not object to the fact that the merchant thought that the old man had destroyed the werewolf, but he continued to be on guard. When Jacob unwrapped the package, he was doubly shocked, as if the verbal proof at the beginning had not been enough. Not believing that he was holding in his hands the real skin and head of a werewolf, and also the leader, the merchant felt that he was either delirious, asleep, or very drunk. While Jacob continued to insist that it was really hard for him to believe that the old man had finally managed to achieve what he had been working towards for so long, which meant there was still gunpowder in the powder flasks, the armed men behind him glanced askance at the counter. Suddenly flashing an evil smile, the merchant let out a quiet laugh and informed the guy that everything had happened as expected. Jacob seemed to say that he believed that Hector could handle it, but there was clearly another meaning behind his words. The subtext of what the bastard was saying turned out to be those same armed guys who appeared like mushrooms after the rain behind the young man's back. Since Kim was still among people, he started a conversation and asked what exactly Jacob was going to do. The scoundrel, having already tried on the skin of a werewolf, asked in response a rhetorical question: isn't his intention obvious? And then asked the guy to get lost for now, in a good way to avoid death. Eugene mentally agreed with himself that faces really don't lie and that in front of him was a vile swindler, and then he exhaled heavily and informed him that Hector trusted the scoundrel. When the guy asked if Jacob had always done business this way, he started snapping and warned the brat to watch his language because he didn't understand anything about investments, and since Hector lived too far away, supplying him was unprofitable. Making a stupid face, the swindler said that he needed the skin to compensate for the accumulated losses. The hunter's eyes turned red, eager to kill, but that would be too unreasonable even though the rage scale was off the charts. The leather gloves creaked from how hard the guy clenched his fists, thinking that he definitely would not kill a person for his skin. The bastard suddenly splashed beer in Eugene's face, literally, after he thought that he was a good guy and the bastard should be glad that his head was still intact. Jacob decided that disrespecting the stranger was not enough, so he decided to also verbally humiliate him, ordering him not to be smart and to get out as quickly as possible. There was such a storm raging inside Gene that he could have razed the entire village to the ground, but even after a glass of beer was spilled in his face, he held on. While maintaining his calm, the guy suddenly gave in, causing the chair to fall to the floor. Kim walked towards the exit and Jacob casually threw a beer mug after him. The bastard, laughing at the stranger, said that the brat had made the right choice and was already reaching for the rest of the goods. But when the sounds from the exit became many times more numerous instead of the usual sound of the door opening and closing, Jacob looked to see what was going on there. Gene carefully closed the doors with all the furniture he could find in the bar. When the deed was done, the hunter turned to Jacob from behind so that he would listen carefully. Since there was silence in the bar, Kim turned to the bastard and said that if he was going to cheat from the very beginning, he should have hit him in the neck and not in the back. Jacob laughed at the stupid boy, saying that he was taking back his words about making the right choice, not yet knowing that soon he would not be able to speak his filthy language at all. The leader told the gang that the guy didn't know the value of his life, thus giving the order to kill. The gang of idiots flew towards certain death with such confident cries that it only added to the desire to kill them quickly. As he drew his sword, Gene briefly wondered if these people would make him feel guilty if they died before their time. Having repelled the first attack, the hunter answered himself that he would not regret these deaths, and so he was already prepared to slaughter everyone. When the first bandit realized from the blow that he had a rather strong opponent in front of him, it was already too late. The bloody eyes themselves were terrifying enough, and now all that was left was to do something, since this wasn't Kim's first time killing. The hunter became interested in how quickly he could deal with people if the last time he defeated a werewolf with one blow. The big guy with the axe was as strong as a bull, but because of this he was not particularly agile, which meant he had a poor sense of his own size. The blow of the axe was enough to kill on the first try, but Kim could inflict many of his own with such a single blow. The mercenary became curious about what would happen if he used the available means and grabbed the table with his hand. The wooden table flew towards the bandit so easily that he didn't even have time to dodge. The collision was inevitable, and that was exactly what Eugene needed to take action. Meanwhile, the scoundrel was distracted by the table, and in order to get out of it, the mercenary intercepted it and struck with a sword, which was quite convenient. Having learned to fight for his lifetime, and again Eugene now looked into the enemy's eyes with only one intention, and words were superfluous. The survivor among the monsters himself became a monster in the eyes of an ordinary person, so Jacob, sweating like the last beast, froze in place, not knowing what to do. While Kim was dealing with the gang of bandits, the merchant couldn't understand how he could have missed such a strong fighter in their area, but he pushed those thoughts aside as he needed to think about an escape route. Watching the hunter mercilessly cut healthy men to pieces, Jacob finally realized that he was at risk of dying for nothing. Eugene was good at dodging attacks, thereby controlling the enemy's movements. The guy knew how to fight not only with a sword but also using his own hands perfectly. The hunter's handwriting was clearly visible from the way he had repeatedly divided the flesh into two parts, no matter in which direction. Kim really didn't regret at all that he had removed so many worthless people from the face of the earth, but this matter was still not finished. The hunter stared at Jacob, indicating that he was next in line to become the corpse no matter where he ran. The merchant finally became truly afraid for his miserable life, and he shouted to those who were still alive to run away wherever their eyes looked. The bandits didn't think long and ran to the first window. Even if they had to jump through the glass, the main thing was not to fall into the clutches of a crazy stranger. Jacob, like the biggest coward, jumped out of the window, saving his rotten soul from the bloodthirsty monster. But the clicking of sharp teeth and a menacing roar made the merchant freeze, lying on the ground instead of breaking free and running. The risk that the bastard would die not at the hands of Kim or at the paws of the beast but from a broken heart was quite high because there had already been quite a lot of shock in a short time. The red dog turned out to be the well-known red wolf, but the bandits were more surprised by what the monster was doing in the village where he had never been. Hearing sounds behind him, Jacob realized that he was in deep shit and didn't really have a choice, but it was too late to even bite his elbows. So the bunch of cowards who remained alive were surrounded from the side by one two-legged monster and another four-legged one. Eugene, despite his boiling blood, noticed the beast ahead, trying to figure out where he had seen it before. The hunter's mind immediately flashed to the memory of a red-haired monster that had quite unexpectedly fled from the battlefield. When Gene tried to ask the beast directly if he was the wolf scout, the seemingly wild creature's menacing face calmed down as if confirming the man's words. The guy looked at the dog with his scary eyes and immediately asked if he had also come to die along with these vile rats. The red wolf was unable to contain his fear at the latest threat from the strange man. The dog fell to the ground and whined, revealing his belly, which meant not just capitulation but trust despite the fear of the deadly stranger. A menacing creature that inspired terror just a couple of minutes ago was already lying on its back in the ground, waving its tail, so that it could have knocked you off your feet. The bandits had no choice but to freeze in even greater shock from what they saw. Kim looked at the wolf with disbelief, thinking in his head that the monster was behaving just like a domestic dog. As soon as the guy thought that the red wolf considered him its master, the animal looked at him with its eyes full of trust. The hunter was interested in confirming or refuting his own theory, so he pointed the bandits out to the wolf and said attack, but due to his wildness, the beast did not immediately understand the word he heard for the first time. Eugene glanced at the dog and pointed his finger at the scoundrels again, repeating the command with interest, watching what would happen next. To the hunter's surprise, the beast crouched down, showing full combat readiness, and its eyes lit up again. The red wolf pounced on the gang of deceivers, and it became immediately clear that there would be no chance of survival. Strong jaws sank into the head of one of the bandits, and even a heart-rending scream did not distract the monster from carrying out its command. It was no trouble for the werewolf to rip the head off the insignificant little man, and blood spurted out like a fountain. Gene stood aside, simply observing, but still considered the wolf's strength to be quite good for someone who would run into the forest from just one glance. Jacob's meager brain was enough to understand after his comrade's head was torn off that he would be next, but he absolutely did not want to die. While the dog was already dealing with the second head, the gang leader needed to think of something very quickly, but in this state his brain refused to work. Little by little, Jacob came to the conclusion that he needed to somehow get out of the situation, and all that was left was to figure out how. The merchant glanced at the stranger and remembered that he was a complete idiot, which meant he could easily be fooled, and this delusion drove Jacob to the grave, because even if the enemy was stupid, it didn't stop him from killing. The idiot decided for himself that if he apologized to the fool a couple of times, he would get away with everything, and then he would not only be able to leave but also possibly finish him off. Behind the petition, one might not even notice the vile face of the swindler, who was just waiting for someone to trustingly turn their back on him. Gene decided to show Jacob his intentions and thrust his sword into the ground, so that the blade slid across the coward's scalp. Blood began to flow from the merchant's forehead in a stream, and one wrong move by the victim himself could mean goodbye to his life, so he decided to be very careful. Kim also lowered his head, although Jacob called out questioningly master and not brat in order to understand what to expect from the madman. The guy calmly glanced at the bastard without taking his sword in order to properly examine the reaction in the eyes of the cornered deer. When the hunter smiled, he really did look crazy, and at that moment he was wondering if the swindler really thought of him as a weakling. Eugene's memories instantly returned to reality, where his boss had also once asked him to turn a blind eye to the situation with the delayed salary. How employee Kim tried to report to his superiors that his salary had not arrived on time, but in response he heard only excuses. The guy was pretty soft-hearted at the time, so he simply accepted the situation and was understanding of the company's position. But right after Gene caved in, his salary still hadn't arrived even after a couple of months, and he worked for nothing considering his health condition. Eugene again tried to talk to his boss about the fact that he hadn't received his salary this month, either, while that jerk was carefree playing golf in his office. The manager not only allowed himself to look at the employee as a piece of shit, but also to call him an ungrateful bastard. The impudent jerk decided that he could even yell at his employee for acting so selfishly and not supporting the company in difficult times. Kim returned to the new reality and thought that surviving from month to month was a terrible feeling, but now he would neither endure nor remain silent. Even though the guy turned his back on Jacob in order to play along with him, a little he still learned one important lesson. The merchant was much more stupid looking at the enemy's back and thinking that it was the fool who exposed his back. The swindler had already imagined how he would kill the stranger and get rich by selling the werewolf's skin, so a hysterical smile spread across his face. Jacob naively grabbed the knife, wanting to put his plan into practice, although he could have acted like a coward and run away, which would have been more effective. The idiot not only screamed die but also rushed at the one who literally a minute ago almost cut his head in half. The hunter understood perfectly well that the idiot couldn't have come up with anything better, so he turned around to finally finish what he had started. To begin with, Eugene intercepted the hand with the dagger, informing Jacob that bastards like him should be punished accordingly for deceiving conscientious people. When the deer was trapped, all that was left was to plunge the sword in, although there was a chance to survive and escape, but now there was no point in struggling. The fraudster's entire body convulsed in one big spasm upon realizing he was a corpse, and his teeth clenched as if they were about to crack under the pressure. Jacob ended his life very abruptly and quietly, since there was no longer any room for his voice to escape from, since his head flew off very quickly. The horror that the merchant experienced at the last moment remained frozen on his face, even when his head was already in the air. While Kim was waiting for the sound of two body parts falling to the ground, he realized that his life would definitely not be the same as before. When the body fell to the ground spraying blood, the guy irrevocably decided for himself that now he would definitely not let himself be offended and would not waste his only life on humiliation. As soon as one matter was resolved, the next task was waiting behind Jean, which was a little more difficult due to a lack of understanding. The dog already held in his teeth a bag of coins that he had managed to take from the bandits and patiently waited for the stranger's attention, hoping that he was not stupid and would not kill him for no reason. The red wolf threw a bag of money jingling at the man's feet, and Kim realized that the dog had decided to follow him. The coins glittered in the sun so temptingly that the hunter's desire to kill subsided. The sword quietly hid in its sheath because money became much more interesting, especially since the need to kill the wolf disappeared by itself. The dog stared at the man, who asked if he really wanted to follow him. The answer to the question was the wolf's sweet and gentle headbutting of the body of such a dangerous two-legged creature. Thus Eugene stroked the head of the ferocious beast, making it clear that he too was ready for such a new cooperation, although it was strange. Kim still didn't fully understand why the red wolf was behaving this way if the leader of the pack had recently been killed before his eyes, but he saw that the animal's trust was not false, unlike those bastards he hadn't killed. The guy even tried to voice something like praise to the animal, and the cunning red beetle even opened one eye. Jean squeezed his new partner's cheek, suggesting that they live together and help each other, and considering that the wolf sat obediently with his eyes closed, he agreed with the man's words. The team of friends stayed overnight in the village, since the road to the next city was not short, and it was worth gathering strength, especially since there was nowhere to rush. Kim made himself comfortable on the bed, and the wolf curled up on the floor, and as soon as he heard in the morning that the man had already woken up, he looked at him out of the corner of his eye. The guy took a deep breath and exhaled, still not believing that he could finally get enough sleep, feeling a normal deep sleep, which was not there in the real world, but in a place teeming with monsters he didn't care. The guys did some sweet stretches together, and this invigorating morning made Eugene feel like he had wings on his back. The world of fantastic creatures had given the hunter a good beating, but he hadn't forgotten how to take care of himself and keep his things in order. Although sometimes Kim got much more tired from routine work than from killing another creature. While washing his clothes from someone else's blood, the mercenary reflected on the fact that for the first time he had killed not just one person but several at once. It wasn't just about thoughts of killing his own kind, but the fact that the guy didn't feel guilty for what he did, and this plunged him deeper into his thoughts. The only thing the hunter came to was that there would be no guilt from killing the scum who were trying to deceive honest people. And the emotions that Eugene experienced while killing bandits were similar to those he felt while hunting monsters, that is, it was excitement. The mercenary touched himself, trying to understand the sensations of his own body, and realized that something had definitely changed, but he didn't yet know what exactly. Looking at his hand, Kim realized that there was practically nothing left of the former office guy, and what to do with his new appearance was also not entirely clear. Thoughts like maybe he was cursed but he survived, which means it was still good, even started to creep into Jin's head. Kim's thoughts about his new life continued even as he and the wolf set out on their journey, and the boy realized that his life was now radically different, which meant his attitude toward the value of this life had also changed. because he would no longer tolerate injustice and wanted to live in abundance. And looking at his companion and everything he encountered along the way, the wanderer decided that the time had come to truly enjoy the new reality. Standing on a hill overlooking the fifth pioneer city, Jean told the wolf that he needed to sell the skin first. Kim asked the dog to stay close but not to be seen by anyone, since for others he was still either an enemy or prey. The mercenary entered the city guided by knowledge from the chronicles, which he read that in order to receive a reward for a monster, he needed to visit the Alliance of Order. Looking back towards the city gates, Kim wondered if it was too rude to call a rather strong and beautiful animal a dog. The potential alliance building looked much more beautiful than the one sitting on a chair by the window and yawning like a wild animal. Eugene unceremoniously approached the yawning man and asked if he had come to the right address, to which the worker asked what exactly the traveler was interested in. The guy dropped a heavy load in front of the worker and he almost fell out of his chair in surprise. Kim, although he looked like a savage as he threw the skin on the table, explained that he would like to receive a reward for the monster. The worker began to unravel the trap, skeptically calling it simply a dog skin and warning that this place was clearly not for pranks. The employee's face changed instantly when he tried to believe his own eyes, whether he had imagined what he saw or not. Due to the skin being pulled tightly into a bundle, the werewolf's head seemed to jump out of the pile of fur, as if alive, causing such a fright in the unfortunate man that he even screamed. The man looked at the stranger with fear, wanting to know if it was the werewolf killer standing in front of him now. Kim calmly stated that he had indeed killed the animal not long ago, and this was evident from the quality of the fur, which looked as if it were alive. The hunter was led to the center and asked to wait in a spacious hall, while the skin's authenticity was checked. Another worker in similar attire entered the room and apologized to the guest for the wait, explaining that due to the large amount of money they had to check the goods first. The man placed a bag of coins on the table which jingled pleasantly and said that the goods were genuine, which meant that a generous reward was due for them. When Eugene touched the bag, he remembered Hector's words, who said that this amount would be enough to live comfortably for 6 or even 7 years. The hunter didn't fully believe the old man's words, but now that he was able to touch a whole bag of coins, he felt ants running across his skin. The mercenary experienced a new sensation in the form of a tremor that was different from what he felt during the hunt, and the money that appeared in his life on time and in the amount that was talked about was a sign that he was on the right path. The worker apologized for disturbing the guest, but asked if he could spare a little more time, and Kim looked at him questioningly. The man asked if the mercenary would be interested in taking on one task, since he had a rather good request. Jean again remembered Hector's words about monster hunters being paid to destroy them, and the guy smiled and said that he was listening carefully. Clearly feeling uncomfortable with what was happening, the worker explained to the hunter that a monster had recently appeared in the quarry, and that it was causing a lot of problems for the workers and therefore for the entire city. The employee added that because the monster prevents workers from entering the quarry, they cannot extract bloodstone, which in turn prevents money from circulating around the city. By the time Kim arrived, the city was already on the brink of ruin, with many people simply dying in the streets. The worker warned that according to the workers, the monster was much stronger than the werewolf and thought that Jean looked like someone who could deal with evil spirits. The hunter didn't really care what kind of creature was sitting in the tunnel, since any animal could go from living to dead, but he still asked who the monster was. The mad skull was causing trouble for the workers, and a reward of 70 gold pieces has already been offered for his capture. Eugene's eyes widened, not only because of the announced amount, which was almost twice the amount he had just received, but also because he had read about the monster in the chronicles. Kim himself clearly remembers his encounter with an overgrown wild boar whose skull was on the outside, not the inside, which is why he was given that nickname. Considering the number of dents on its skull, the monster was quite a tough nut to crack. The boar's aggressiveness and endurance were much greater than those of the werewolf, meaning it was already a worthy opponent. Jean understood that people had a hard time with such a scourge because during his first encounter with the mad skull, it took him a month to kill the creature, and he died almost every day, which means about 28 times. The worker did not insist and did not decide for the mercenary, since he understood that the task was mortally dangerous, so he simply asked if the hunter could take on such a task. Kim paused to think about the offer, since he already had money on hand, but the thought of a double sum and the desire to test himself against a more worthy opponent pushed the hunter to agree. The quarry was impressive in size for one that was built without the technology that Kim remembered from real life. The mercenary noticed how the skull's appearance affected the work of the quarry, which became quiet as a wasteland. The mine already had a gloomy appearance, and the knowledge that there was a ferocious creature in it created a completely eerie atmosphere, so the hunter did not want to linger here. Eugene was walking past one of the entrances when suddenly a man called out to him, asking him to wait a minute. The guy was getting ready to take out his sword, but a disarmed mercenary came out to him, politely asking Kim to wait his turn since he and his team were the first to arrive and were preparing for battle. Gene was shocked by such a request and asked out loud since when there was a queue for monster hunting, since such a thing was not mentioned during the conversation with the Alliance worker. The team leader also felt awkward about the situation, but he couldn't do anything about the way things turned out. The red-haired guy very actively offered the stranger to join his team and hunt together, but this made Kim, who was used to fighting alone, even more wary. A decision had to be made, and Eugene began to analyze that if the mercenary team went first they would win, and it would only take his time, but he didn't have to go with them. The hunter was increasingly inclined to refuse the offer to work together, since then the spoils would have to be divided between everyone, but given the ferocity of the Mad Skull, working together would be more convenient. Another trigger that became a big minus in the choice to join was how they behaved last time with Eugene, who also seemed like ordinary merchants but in fact turned out to be scammers. The guy realized that he wasn't ready to trust the people here so easily again, so he asked directly why the captain needed to take another person if he already had plenty of his own people. The boss admitted that he was ashamed of this, but he would prioritize safety over efficiency so one more person wouldn't hurt him. The mercenary looked at Gene and without joking said that it would help everyone if the guy joined them, and then asked that the hunter was strong. Eugene was hooked by the question and he felt there was some kind of catch, but he still asked how the local knew that he was strong. The captain pointed to the side and clarified that the red wolf would definitely not be following a weakling, and at that moment someone was petting the dog. The dog happily licked the face of a very beautiful girl who explained that wolves are very independent, which is why even the Alliance of Order couldn't tame them, and then one of the strongest went and became a human, which meant a lot. Gene froze in shock, not knowing what to do next, but in his thoughts, he was already scolding the dog for telling him to hide. It was clear from the wolf's face that he couldn't refuse the tasty piece of meat, and Kim also understood that this had captivated the animal, since he himself had never tried the local meat dish. Sobakevich knew that he would most likely get it from the two-legged one, but he couldn't help himself because the food was terribly delicious, and he noticed this from its reaction. A juicy piece of meat on the bone fell to the ground, although the wolf could have eaten it whole even with the bone without choking. And the next moment the animal pushed its prey to the man it barely knew so that he would not also die of hunger, and this gesture was a shock to everyone. The meat almost shone for Kim. He wanted to try it so much, but he felt angry that the dog treated him so disrespectfully, as if someone would eat it. And food beckoned to man, and his pride began to subside and be suppressed under the influence of satisfying his basic needs. Along with the sweat on his face, saliva began to flow from his mouth at such a speed that Gene did not have time to swallow it. The man, who was taller than the dog, mechanically reached for a piece of meat, not understanding how it happened by itself, while his thoughts were that if he thought about it, he had never eaten anything like it. Behind the greedy feeling of the voice in my head, panic also arose because there was food on the ground, also from the wolf's mouth and his saliva. Just as Kim was thinking about human dignity and was about to reach for the dirty food, the girl's hand touched his. The beautiful lady smiled at the stranger and handed him a package of fresh food, saying that if the hunter was hungry he could simply say so. Gene had never been in such a state of prostration before, and his hunger became so strong that even his stomach felt completely different. And due to the fact that Eugene was also given meat by a beautiful girl, he also perceived her as a goddess who could be trusted, but this was a little later due to the delirium of a hungry man. The mercenary nevertheless joined the captain's team and walked last, savoring the juicy meat. Gene hadn't eaten such delicious meat food for a long time, from which not only juice flowed but also spices resembled the spiciness of Sichuan cuisine, and it was all so far from the raw meat of monsters that he survived on. The so-called goddess turned to Kim again and sweetly informed him that they hadn't even introduced themselves to each other. The red-haired man introduced himself as Jonathan, captain of the Black Marlin mercenary group, and the girl called herself Claire. Kim started saying his full name out of habit and remembered that it was difficult for the locals, so he introduced himself as Gene, and the captain expressed his joy that the guy went with them and asked that if they had any questions don't hesitate to ask for the answers. Another strange smile on Jonathan's face was not visible to Gene, but this did not mean that he completely trusted strangers. Finding themselves in a huge spacious square, the captain announced that they had arrived at the right place and that there would be a battle with the Mad Skull. Jonathan asked the trap team to prepare their nets and the spear team to take up their positions. The captain turned to Claire and said that it was time for them to start too, so as not to delay the matter. Kim stood as if spellbound, looking at something he didn't expect to see. the magic that the girl was about to use. Even though Jim was in a fantasy world, he was so focused on the creatures alone that he didn't even think about magic, which is also the norm here. The hunter saw with his own eyes what he had only read about in the chronicles, and now the girl is demonstrating with her own hands what the brain refuses to believe. The girl called on magic to send a blessing to the land on which she and her entire team stood. The spell that Claire used was called Feather Step, and Jonathan was given it to carry out his mission. The captain praised the girl for the fact that her buffs were as always magnificent, which meant that everything would go as well as possible. The girl warned the captain that he would have 5 minutes at best and 3 at worst, so he should hurry. Jonathan stepped forward and shouted to the team to get ready for the star of the show. The captain's speed, thanks to the spell, was so swift that the wind blew people away. Kim was amazed by what magic could do and considered it even cooler than being a mercenary. The guy looked at Claire and thought about whether he could also skillfully use magic if he learned it. Judging by the way the man told everyone to be on guard and not to slack off, he was clearly the captain's right-hand man who would replace him if necessary. The deputy asked everyone to be prepared because if one person makes a mistake, everyone else will die. Eugene also prepared himself, considering the plan to drive Skull into a trap and then kill him to be quite good. It remains to be seen whether even such a good strategy will work on the Mad Skull. Meanwhile, Jonathan was already running away from the ferocious boar as fast as he could, dragging him into a trap. The captain managed to escape death and at the same time shout out commands about combat readiness. So far, everything was going according to plan because the spell was enough and the boar was running in the right direction. The network worked instantly despite the size of the beast because everything worked harmoniously as one mechanism. The little people had to work hard to pull the net and prevent the boar from escaping. The net miraculously did not tear when the skull pressed its sharp fangs against it. The captain trusted his crew so much that he stood right in front of the creature, shouting to the team of spearmen to get their weapons ready. The hunters raised not ordinary spears but entire harpoons with sharp parts that would not have been easy to get out. The weapon flew at the beast, which did not stop kicking, and now the most important thing was to restrain it after it became even more ferocious. The boar screamed furiously, showing that no one would remain alive here. The men made a huge mistake in tying ropes around themselves and trying to hold the net. The monster reared up, causing almost the entire grid team to fly into the air. Kim looked at what was happening and realized that things were not just bad but downright shitty. Realizing that the meeting would have been inevitable in any case, the hunter only watched as Skull went wild and scattered everyone to smithereens. The mercenaries held the boar back with all their might, even though they were the most numerous. A crazy skull is crazy for a reason. It can tear apart even the strongest nets and kill only more people. The monster was driven only by bloodlust, and the most it could do was choose a tastier victim. Thus Skull's choice fell on Claire, who froze in horror and could not move. The girl understood that magic definitely wouldn't help her now, but she also had no escape routes. Kim appeared before the sorceress like the wind, already knowing what to do with the boar. Usually they take the bull by the horns, but Gene had a special case, so he grabbed Skull's fangs as tightly as possible, trying to stop him. No matter how strong a hunter Kim was, physics still exists, so his legs began to slide along the ground from the pressure from the beast. Gene felt the meeting with his old acquaintance in a completely different way, and he certainly wasn't going to die for the 29th time. The creature looked with its bloody eyes at the little thing that he could have killed with just one movement, but it still did not give in. Claire yelled at Gene that his actions looked quite dangerous, thereby trying to express her concerns. But the mercenary asked the girl not to worry because no matter who, he certainly knew how to kill the insatiable boar. Gene finally got the chance to fight a worthy opponent, even if he wouldn't get any money for it, but he would satisfy that same feeling of excitement that had helped him survive more than once. The hunter knew what he had to do with the ferocious creature, but he had to put in a little effort first. He pulled off a dangerous trick to give the boar the opportunity to gain the upper hand. Kim abruptly pushed the monster aside, and thanks to his strength it moved forward. The hunter had only a moment to draw his sword before the animal was distracted. Eugene felt that it seemed like it had become easier to move due to the improvement of his skills, but at the same time the client was still difficult. Even with the powerful blow of Jin's sword, the situation did not change one bit, but only a small gap appeared again to understand what to do next. The mercenary felt that he had become stronger by the 29th encounter with the monster, but he still had room to grow. The only thing that angered the Mad Skull was the fact that the little man was getting in the way and poking him with his sharp sword. Due to his own thoughts, Kim realized that he had let down his guard only when the boar's Iklo appeared right in front of his face. In parallel with the mortal danger, the same feathers that were flying when Claire activated the magic appeared next to Eugene. If the sorceress had not pulled the hunter out, the boar would have already pierced the body, but for now his life was saved. For the first time, Kim felt the influence of a magical buff from which his body became as light as feathers that flew everywhere, or as if he had thrown off a heavy backpack. Jin's confidence in victory was strengthened by the fact that Claire volunteered to help, and now all that was left was to carry out the plan. The team ran towards the hunter, and the captain shouted that everyone was ready to help the guy win, but he shouted for everyone to go back and not come closer. Jonathan did not understand the mercenary's reaction because fighting alone was the same as going to certain death, but it was worth remembering that the Red Wolf was following this man, which meant he knew what he was doing. Using his magical enhancement, Kim shouted to everyone that it would be easier for him to be alone for now, and slipped right under the boar's nose to attract his attention. Eugene lured Skull back into the tunnel, knowing full well that to hunt this creature you only need to know two important things. The animal rushed with terrible force towards the small man, and he ran away, realizing that no matter what the monster was called, it was first and foremost just a pig. The skull started hitting the walls of the tunnel, and this was the first part of Kim's plan because pigs are really fast if they run in a straight line, but turns are their weak point. Therefore, the mine with its numerous turns played into the hunter's hands in order to stop the boar first. The skull ran so fast that due to its enormous mass, it broke through one of the walls that was in its path, and together with the boulders flew further by inertia. Unaware of its size, the monster could not really stand on its feet, and its hooves became terribly slippery on the stone. The boar sprawled on the ground, and boulders immediately fell on him, which even if they didn't kill him would certainly stop him for a while. Eugene only got more into the swing of things thanks to the buff's power, as now the tired boar would have even more trouble keeping up, meaning he could begin the second part of the plan. The second weak and at the same time strong point of the animal were its fangs, which served as hands for a person. Eugene had already remembered that it would be impossible to cut Skull's fangs with a sword, which meant he needed to strike at a more vulnerable spot. The fangs, like sharp blades, protected the pig's weak spot, namely the nose, and that's where the hunter struck. The boar squealed furiously from the terrible pain that he had never experienced before because everyone was trying to break his skull, mistakenly thinking that it was a weak spot. After being seriously wounded, the more the monster moved, the more terrible the pain became, and this dulled its reaction to attack. Kim didn't waste any time realizing that magic wasn't spring and the boar could disappear again, so he ran towards him. The hunter dealt the most fatal blow to the animal, and these were the tendons on the hind legs, without which it would no longer be able to move and therefore would die. Eugene had to cut the remaining parts of the body to ensure the pig's final death. The mercenary's eyes were burning with the quenching of his thirst for excitement, because now that such prey was dead, it was possible to find the essence. The captain and his crew rushed to search for the hunter and the boar, not knowing whose death they were preparing for. All the mercenaries saw in front of them was rubble, and Jonathan no longer understood how it all ended, but Claire said that they should still look for Kim. A wolf blocked the people's path, making it clear that it was not yet worth going towards the rubble, knowing that the hunt for the person he was walking with was not yet over. Sobacon didn't exactly ferociously forbid the team to move forward, but he definitely made it clear that they needed to wait. The captain caught the werewolf's mood and stopped Claire, as she was still ready to go look for Jean. The dog turned towards Kim and growled loudly, making it clear that they had already come for him, and Claire tried to understand what the animal wanted. After the wolf's call, Eugene appeared before the team, safe and sound except for one detail that also left everyone shocked. While the hunter was finishing chewing the essence that he couldn't resist, he was already being bombarded with questions about how he survived and where Skull was now. Kim explained to the people that such a monster as the Mad Skull no longer exists, and at first no one understood his words. When the guy pointed out where to look, he concluded that now only a huge amount of pork remained. Jonathan was over the moon, praising the hunter for doing it alone, but at the same time he couldn't believe it. The red wolf suddenly sniffed and growled, staring somewhere further in the direction of the tunnel. Everyone present noticed the animal's reaction, but it only sent a chill down their spines because Skull was dead, and it was unclear who the dog was growling at. Another boar actually appeared from the tunnel, and behind it another silhouette glowed with red lights. The pig growled terribly, baring its teeth, and it seemed that now the end had come for everyone because the mercenaries had not prepared for this. All the captain managed to say was for everyone to get ready for battle, although their eyes couldn't believe that it turned out there was another skull. Claire ordered everyone to stop as if she saw much more than the armed hunters. It turns out that a pig with children came out of the tunnel, and it became clear whose red eyes were glowing in the dark. The little monsters squealed pitifully, clearly calling for their father, who was no longer answering. The pig also looked sadly towards where the dead body lay and made a sad sound as if telling the children that their father was no longer alive. The wolf was still determined, but Jean didn't even move towards the animals, realizing that they were clearly not in the same mood as their fellows. The piglets were already turning in the other direction to leave, clearly obediently doing what the sow asked. Everyone froze watching as the boar family simply and peacefully turned around to leave. Claire shared her guess that the pig clearly planned to raise babies in this tunnel, which means Skull was simply protecting them, and the captain admitted that he now even somehow regrets that everything happened this way. Jonathan added that he was glad that the family had passed away peacefully, because he certainly wouldn't have wanted to kill them, while Kim silently watched the animals. In the evening, in the fifth city of pioneers, a big catch was being celebrated cheerfully in one of the taverns. Joyful shouts and whistles could be heard from the establishment in celebration of the big catch. Jonathan praised everyone on his team and was glad that no one was seriously injured, and he was even happier that everything worked out for them. The captain made the most important statement, stating that their efforts were not in vain. The hunters whistled and shouted in anticipation because they really had something to celebrate. Jonathan dumped a pile of bags full of sweetly jingling coins on the table, and Claire immediately asked if 70 gold coins were too much. The leader laughed loudly, saying that he had made a noise, thanks to which there were many more bags. Jonathan explained to the guys that he demanded more because in the tunnel there was not only the mad skull but also a pig with piglets, which meant the work was much more dangerous and therefore the reward should be greater. With a broad smile, the captain announced the reward of 110 gold coins, and the crew went crazy over such numbers. Kim immediately asked the boss that they didn't fight with the mother, but the alliance still gave the money. Jonathan made a sly face and said that he had embellished a little about how many pigs had been killed. The team was even more jubilant at how their captain was able to pull it all off. Jean didn't argue but just thought to himself that he had finally met some truly interesting people. The captain suddenly put his hand on the hunter's shoulder, asking the team for attention, and Eugene also froze, not understanding what was happening. Jonathan told everyone his decision to give half of his earnings to his new friend because it was fair, and asked if anyone objected, while Kim stood in shock. The guy asked the captain why they were giving him half if he had a whole team under his command. The chief smiled and admitted to the hunter that if it weren't for him, everyone would have died in that mine like dogs, so he asked the guy to accept the reward with joy. Jonathan turned back to his men, informing them that with the pay increase there would be enough for everyone even if the amount was split. Eugene looked at the people and saw that the team really thought exactly the same as the captain. The guy realized that he himself would have died if not for the magic and trap of Jonathan's team. With the thought that not all people in this world are vile, Kim took hold of his mug of beer. The hunter raised his drink to this completely new evening for him with gratitude to everyone, and announced that in this case, he would pay for the drinks, thereby causing a furor among everyone. The bullies started drinking straight from the barrels, threatening the new guy that he would regret deciding to pay for all the drinks. Amidst the cries of drinking to the bottom, Kim couldn't miss how Claire calmly got up from the table and headed for the exit. The genie asked where the girl was going, and she said that despite the fun, she was waiting for practice in magic. Considering how the hunter was struck by magic in the mine, he was now interested in how exactly Claire would practice. The girl actually settled comfortably in the fresh air, taking off her shoes to be closer to the ground, and worked on improving her skills. From the outside, Claire looked like she was meditating, which could be part of the process, but it was primarily training and discipline. Kim watched quietly from the side, admiring the fact that despite her fatigue, the sorceress began training immediately after the hunt. The very word magic attracted Jean and awakened the desire to try and learn something new for himself. The hunter was especially inspired and motivated to explore the unknown when he saw how Claire was able to control magic. Imagine the surprise of Claire and the rest of the people when she heard from Kim the next day that he would like to learn magic, but the girl happily agreed. Jean became suspicious that Claire agreed so easily and quickly until she said that she was just about to give the guy a gift. The sorceress, pouting demonstratively, said that when the skull attacked them, it was Jean who saved her, unlike some others, and at that moment Jonathan, who was standing behind her, understood everything. Claire said that teaching the hunter magic is the least she can do for her salvation because if a group of mercenaries who did not protect their mage asked to teach them she would refuse, but this does not concern Jean. Jonathan approached the offended sorceress saying that things couldn't be resolved that way, especially since magic couldn't be taught overnight and the village had to be abandoned in 2 days. The girl immediately dug in her heels saying that Jean could have simply gone with the team, but the captain concluded that there was no point in a lone hunter going with the likes of them. Jonathan rather theatrically approached Kim and placing his hand on his shoulder instead of his decided that the brave wolf was more comfortable on his own, and it would be rude of them to interfere with such a man's journey. Eugene thought in his mind that everything was absolutely not as John had said because in reality there was nothing to do and he decided that he would save face as much as possible. The next moment the hunter decided to lie a little and asked where the mercenaries were heading, next to which he heard about a 4th city where the next major mission was. Jean pretended that he was also planning to go there and asked if he could join the team, while Kim added that if he went with the guys he would also learn magic. Behind his back Claire and Jonathan were already giggling slyly because the fish had bitten the hook. A chill ran down Eugene's spine as the captain patted him on the back telling him it was a wonderful coincidence, and Claire said it was an honor for them to have such an ally. Kim was quietly glad that his next destination had already been determined, and that it was much more interesting than wandering around alone even though there was a wolf nearby. The mercenaries set out on their journey not on their own but with a huge assistant in the form of a monster which they were also able to tame just like Kim the wolf. Something resembling both a lizard and a turtle was called a Tarrasque, and it was one of the few spent monsters that was bred for use as transport. Jean remembered that he had also read about the Tarrasque in the chronicles and that it was clearly used instead of horses or donkeys, and while the guy walked alongside and looked at the huge creature it also looked at the small man. The captain shouted to everyone to be patient because the journey was already beginning and it would not be close. Eugene in turn, as he said, really began to study magic, and it turned out to be much more difficult than it seemed. The hunter was prepared for the fact that learning something new would be difficult, but the hardest thing turned out to be repeating the same thing. Eugene didn't see the point in getting angry and trying to do everything faster because he understood that there are stages where you can only grow through repetition. The training sometimes reached the point where it slowed down or stopped completely, but this was not the worst thing that happened to the guy, so he did not stop. Eugene's strength lay in the fact that he was already familiar with this painful state, so when it came to the torment of repetition, he went through it easier in any case than fighting a monster. The hunter could be grateful to himself for the 12 years he had endured in the demonic world and thereby strengthened his spirit and body. The first spark flashed before Kim's eyes as soon as he thought about what he would repeat until he got something right. The guy was afraid not only to move but even held his breath so as not to frighten the first result. Claire managed to see the first glimmer and was already walking joyfully clapping her student for being able to sense magic, to which he disappointedly asked if it was really just mana. Jean was really upset that in 10 days he could only sense mana and it turned out to be really difficult. Claire sat down next to him and admitted that the student was indeed a little slow but he still had results, and if you take some people without talent they would live their entire lives without feeling mana. The sorceress opened her bag and took out a vial of shining liquid saying that now we could proceed to the second stage. The girl poured the required amount of magical liquid into the bowl, and it was as if a spell was flying around her. Putting a glove on one hand, Claire politely asked the guy to take off his outerwear. The leather glove creaked ominously when the girl clenched her hand into a fist, and the request to undress sounded very frightening to the stern hunter. Claire dipped her gloved fingers into the shining liquid and apologized to Jean in advance for the fact that it would be a little uncomfortable from the cold. The sorceress quickly drew the necessary spell on the hunter's back, and when he asked what exactly she was doing he heard that the spell was paving the way for mana to enter the body. Claire reported all her steps, and when she finished drawing the diagram she also said that she would now introduce mana, so she asked the guy to feel it well. Kim showed attentiveness not only to the words of the mentor but to her in general. The symbols and signs turned into a kind of hologram when Claire activated the spell. Eugene glowed as if covered in fluorescent paint, but the sensations changed too. What the hunter felt was so different from all his previous discoveries that he could not even express in words the scale of his feelings. Jin's feelings went from superficial and physical to deep, and they flowed even thicker than blood. Claire asked if the guy felt mana, to which he confirmed that he definitely felt something spreading throughout his body. The sorceress did her job and continued to explain that the student had taken the first step towards using magic and that in general there were 3 stages of training. According to the mentor, the first stage was to feel the mana, the second was to accumulate it in the body, and the third was to only use magic. Claire said that given that Jean had successfully completed the first stage, they could move on to the second. The mentor warned that she would control mana and direct it to the heart, and asked the student to use the sensation of holding his breath to create a vessel in the body for storing magic. Sweat was pouring down Eugene's face from concentrating on his internal and external body, and now he also had to be prepared to accumulate mana in his body. Claire warned that it was beginning to fill, and the glow became blindingly bright, and the wind lifted the leaves from the ground. Tongues of light were drawn to the student's body like a sponge that instantly absorbed the incoming energy. Suddenly, some images of two insects appeared before Claire, of which the victim was a moth and the killer was a praying mantis. The creepy green monster bit into the butterfly's body, greedily cutting it to shreds. The monster was not only bloodthirsty but also looked pleased with such prey. The most terrible thing happened when the creature turned sharply towards the sorceress, noticing her ephemeral presence. In an instant, not just a monster approached the girl, but a multitude of eyes that looked into her very soul to devour it. The poor girl sat in shock from the student's ominous energy, which she felt very clearly. Claire didn't want to believe in one theory that she suspected, only because if it turned out to be true, it would become even more scary. When she felt the power flowing from her back straight into the hunter's back, she realized that things were bad. The sorceress tried to do something to push away somehow, but at that moment almost a black hole was pulling her power into Kim's body. Claire felt terrified as she realized that her mana was being absorbed, and at this rate it would be drained dry. The girl didn't notice how the red wolf's appendage wrapped around her to pull her out. The dog arrived just in time, as Claire's strength was really tightening up quickly. The sorceress woke up only when the wolf put her on the ground behind him to increase the distance. The dog stared sullenly at the girl as if asking if she was okay. Since Claire was close to nature, she still understood to some extent that the wolf sensed that she was in danger and rushed to help. When the sorceress fell to the ground without strength, Jean also ran up and asked how she was feeling. The girl didn't know what to answer, so the guy asked again if she was okay, and it was clear that he definitely didn't mean anything bad. Claire, although silent, caught for herself that the horror she saw was the student's mental world. The mental world of a person was considered to be when the strength and nature of a person take form and appear as a whole world, which in this case was a terrible creature thirsty to eat living things. Each person has their own world because it depends on the life they have lived, and what was inside Kim only caused fear and many questions. While Eugene looked at Claire, she still saw in him that monster with many eyes and refused to believe that something like that lived inside this man. The girl was finally able to get up and ask the guy to answer her honestly one question. The question was so spot on that it would have been impossible to avoid it, as Claire asked if Jean had eaten the core. Kim first asked again whether the sorceress really wanted to know about the inner core, since he called it something else. When the girl clarified that she meant something like a crystal inside the monster's body, Kim understood, and paraphrasing it as the monster's essence, confirmed that he had eaten it. Claire burst into a scream and grabbed the guy by the shoulders, yelling why the hell he ate the inner core, and immediately told him to name the quantity. The sorceress turned pale when she heard that the hunter had been eating kernels for 10 years straight, so they could no longer be counted, since in this way there could already be tens of thousands of them. The guy scratched the back of his head, not understanding what the problem was, to which Claire again shouted that this was no longer just a problem but a disaster. The sorceress tried to convey to the hunter that if a person eats the core of a monster, he will either die or turn into a monster himself. After Claire's words, the essence eater's face instantly changed from the understanding of what he had done to himself. In addition to the core and the mental world, Kim also learned about karma, or as it is also called, retribution, which in his past real world was perceived completely differently than here in the fantasy world. In the demonic world, karma was a murky energy that was quite common there. Living beings that absorbed karma acquired bizarre abilities, and the core of the monster was a clot that was formed by the karma that accumulated in the body. The journey to the fourth city continued, but while the captain and Kim were talking, Claire felt anxiety creeping up on her every time she turned to the student. The girl wasn't so much bothered by Jin's strangeness in general, but by her knowledge of who the dark priest was, and everything stretched from those very gates to the other world from which karma had burst forth and swallowed up the fantasy world, as the chronicles said. With the opening of the gates, not only monsters appeared but also people who followed the monsters, who absorbed karma and began to call them angels. The followers devoured the monsters' cores and even sacrificed other people to appease the monsters. Knowing this information about the Death Eaters, Claire remembered what Jean had said about his survival over the past 10 years. And when the girl's memory also flashed back to the vision of a monster with many eyes that she saw inside the guy, she naturally thought that he could be a dark priest. There is always time to panic, so Claire tried to control herself and think rationally, and the first thing she thought was that if the hunter were a priest, he would not have openly said that he ate the cores and would not have shown his mental world. While the sorceress walked on thinking that everything had now become even more terrible, Kim had already managed to kill another creature. As if yesterday there had been no serious conversation about death or turning into a monster, Eugene calmly threw another candy into his mouth. And Claire continued to rack her brains, wondering if even if the hunter didn't know about the danger of the cannonballs, then why bother picking up and eating those creepy things on the table? The sorceress could do nothing but confirm for herself the strangeness of the man walking next to her, and Kim in turn once saw other monsters eating kernels and simply began to repeat after them. Judging by the way the guy was chewing something with relish, even though there was neither bread nor bone in his hand, Claire said again and very insistently that it would be better to stop eating the kernels right now, because until now it was just luck that death had not occurred, and Jean felt awkward. Eugene walked and thought that according to the girl, death or transformation should have occurred, but in front of her was living proof of the opposite, which meant that the information could be wrong. At the same time, the hunter thought that the theory might be true, since he for his part felt nothing after killing people, and the desire to kill periodically returns. Kim decided to leave this food for thought for now, as many factors converge and diverge at the same time. The guy went forward, coldly answering the girl that he would try to force her to shout again that this was not a buffet but that it needed to stop immediately, period. Claire pulled out a trump card from her sleeve by explaining to the student that if he continued to eat the kernels he would risk not only his life but also that he would not be able to use magic, and it worked. Kim turned around and asked the sorceress if he really couldn't become a magician, to which she sighed heavily, thinking, well, could magic really be more important than life? The girl said that in the student's current state it would be difficult to master the manifestation of mana, but there was no need to worry too much. Claire also added that at least Jean should still be able to use mana arts. Eugene stared at the teacher, not understanding what she meant, and asked her to explain. So through conversation and discussion, the team reached the 4th city of pioneers. There were quite a few other mercenaries in the main square of the city who were clearly waiting for something. Jean immediately noted that they weren't alone here, but Claire explained that it wasn't much. The sorceress told the student that although the scale was truly impressive, the order was being carried out under the supervision of the Holy Knight, who had just arrived at the square. The sullen, fair-haired guy was the same Holy Knight named Raymond. When everyone was delighted or shocked by the appearance of the law enforcement officer, Kim could not share such a violent reaction with everyone. All the hunter acknowledged when the knight passed by was that he had a powerful aura that could not be compared with other mercenaries, and at first glance one could tell that Raymond was an unusual person. Jean asked if the square was always so crowded, if the Holy Knight was in charge, to which Claire explained the order that came from Wolf the Golden Bug. The eyes of the lover of the rich inner world of monsters lit up at the name of the beetle, and the sorceress asked him not to tell her that the guy didn't know about the beetle. Judging by Kim's face, he really didn't know anything about Wolf, and Claire even said out loud somewhat sadly that all he really knew was how to hunt. This time the captain explained that Wolf, or the Gold Beetle, is the greatest merchant and magnate with a huge fortune, and is considered one of the richest people in the world. Not only did Kim just find out today about a rich bigwig like Wolf, but it also turned out that he recently died suddenly. What interested Jean most was the word suddenly, and when he asked Jonathan if Wolf had been killed, he said that it was just a rumor, but no one knew anything for sure yet. The next logical question from the savage from the forest was why so many mercenaries had gathered if Wolf had died. John said that Wolf had 2 sons left, and since they were the heirs to all of Dad's property, someone needed to transport the gold beyond the barrier, which was the order. Now Jean realized that there was nothing surprising in such a crowd of people who would like to transport Wolf's entire fortune. The next group the knight called was Jonathan's Black Marlin crew. The captain pushed Kim forward, saying that this was such a crucial moment and that he couldn't do it without the guy. John introduced Jean to the Holy Knights as the team's main force and the one who defeated Skull and tamed the werewolf. Among the other mercenaries, conversations immediately began, especially about the fact that everyone was seeing this man for the first time and he didn't at all look like the one who could have killed Skull. Kim was already completely confused and quietly asked the captain what the hell was going on and why he was a skull crusher, to which John asked him to be patient for a little while and everything would be fine. Raymond looked carefully at both the blockheads, but understanding that reputation wouldn't lie, he made a decision. The Black Marlin mercenary group was given a reward of 100 gold coins and ordered to set out tomorrow at first light. John, happy as a child, said something like "let's go," while Gina was surprised that they paid gold for transporting luggage. The captain explained to the guy that this is how business works, where half is paid for labor and half for reputation. Jonathan finally explained that Kim's reputation as a skull crusher had earned the team a great deal, but the guy didn't understand what it meant to be called him now. The captain remembered that he was dealing with a stronger but more savage man, and explained that Gene now had a nickname that the people had given him, which meant that the hunters smashed the skulls of monsters. The first thing Eugene thought was that the person who came up with such nicknames had no imagination at all. While the captain was delighted with his future reward, Kim was pleased that he had become famous without having done much to achieve it. The knights watched the newcomer as he thought that his fame would now help him in learning the art of mana. The evening was spent in the mercenary camp, but not over a glass of beer, but with a much more interesting pastime. More precisely, those who were not in the ring spent the evening with beer, but the fighters were the most active. In the fight, it was best to see who was good at what, who would definitely go transport the Beatles' fortune tomorrow, and who would be left knocked out. Jean also became curious to try fighting, but Claire asked if he was sure about it, to which he reminded her of the girl's words about the knight's mastery of mana. Kim explained that he planned to attract the attention of the knights and learn their skills, and also asked the girl not to worry, since he was not just going to punch people in the face but would act according to plan. Warming up before the fight, Eugene recalled that according to the Chronicles, holy knights are those who show interest when they see someone strong, and if they recognize strength, then they can count on good treatment in the future. Raymond was just looking at the dark horse from afar, as it was definitely interesting even when recording the groups for transportation. If the plan was to attract attention, then it certainly wouldn't be difficult for Kim. The guy knew that the arena wasn't just for fighting, but for risking his reputation, so there was a high probability of attracting the knight's attention through a fight. The first fight began with Kim moving thoughtfully and smoothly while his opponent, like a bull, simply ran straight ahead. The hunter's movements were so slippery that it was difficult to grab him like a loach. But Jean intercepted the enemy's attack and dealt him a good blow. The opponent was already disoriented, so Kim grabbed his head tightly and, leaning back, prepared to show what he was capable of. Kim thought that since he was a skull crusher, he needed to hit accordingly, even though there was a human in front of him. The host immediately noted that the skull crusher fully lives up to his nickname, and someone even started shouting at the bastard to get ready for the next fight, supposedly making a threat. Eugene didn't care about the shouts. He noticed the most important thing that drew Raymond's attention to himself. The hunter decided that he couldn't be content with just attention and decided that the show was just beginning, after which he carried the cockpit to the next opponent. Essentially, each subsequent opponent was knocked out just for the attention that the slightly wild guy so desperately needed. The most important thing in all of Kim's fights with anyone was the variety of techniques, and not just one, which is why his attacks were more difficult to read. While defeating a couple of opponents, Eugene wanted Raymond to wonder who this madman was. But the plan was to put dozens of opponents in the arena for the greedy interest and excitement of the knights. It remains to be seen whether, if Raymond is truly a true knight, he will react to the newcomer quite obviously. Namely, Kim was waiting for Raymond to ask Rex to fight a guy who could put down quite a lot of opponents. Raymond really wanted to pit his apprentice knight against Jean, which really outraged him because fighting a simple mercenary is low. The hunter waited for the right moment, which happened exactly according to plan, and now it was possible to act further. Kim glanced at the knights and briefly replied that he refused to fight Rex. Raymond's apprentice was shocked by what he heard, and Jean at that moment thought that this was how negotiations about teaching the art of mana would begin. Claire stood in exactly the same stupor as Rex, realizing that Jean's plan had a rather dangerous side. And poor Jonathan already had a vision of the 100 gold coins that they could lose to the wild idiot. Those present were also unable to contain their surprise, and silence fell in which everyone held their breath, not understanding what would happen next because no one had spoken to the knights like that before. Rex was already a pretty hot-tempered guy, and now a lousy mercenary is disgracing his honor. Raymond did not calm the ardor of his apprentice, but at the same time, he did not say anything to his opponent, who acted rather harshly. The first thing Raymond asked Kim was whether he had refused the fight earlier, because this was the only reason that first came to mind. Eugene smiled sweetly and demonstratively raised his hands, saying that he was safe and sound. After Raymond confirmed that the fighter was okay, he asked why the mercenary was refusing the duel. Kim explained his position clearly by saying that he is a mercenary who craves money, fame, and power, and since someone like him must fight the apprentice of the holiest knight, it certainly won't happen just like that. Jean did not delay his proposal, so he voiced his desire to make a bet. Raymond wasn't stupid and clarified that in order to conclude a deal there had to be some value on both sides, and it was still unclear what the hunter wanted to offer on his side. Eugene leaned towards his bag, saying that he was not an important bird to raise someone's reputation, but he had an indecently large amount of money, and that was exactly what he could offer. To prove this, Kim took out one of the bags of money and clearly showed that he was not lying. The crowd went crazy, shouting that the hunter was a real psychopath if he offered a bet to a knight for whom honor is above all else. Rex became even more enthusiastic after hearing people's reactions, realizing that his reputation was already tarnished. The apprentice was about to throw himself at the usual face, forgetting that he would make things worse for himself if he gave in to his emotions, but Raymond was there as always, and he stopped his friend, telling his rival that they didn't need his money. Instead of money, the Holy Knight demanded a release from liability for any damage caused during the battle. Kim liked the knight's demands since he wouldn't even have to pay compensation, which meant he could give his opponent a thorough beating, and the hunter said he'd communicated his desire after the fight. Rex walked into the arena and looked at Eugene like he was a mangy dog who didn't even deserve a beating. The opponents' gazes met, and if Rex looked like a fighter determined to win or something like that, then Eugene looked at his opponent like an animal at prey. People started shouting that they had bet their entire fortune on the Skull Crusher, but for the hunter himself this meant nothing because he would fight exclusively for his own purposes. Before the fight, Claire asked the guy to give her a sign if it suddenly became mortally dangerous, to which he again asked not to worry. Jean turned to Rex and with a smile informed himself and everyone else that he would win. Rex in turn asked the saint how far he could go and received permission to give it his all. Raymond warned his apprentice that this man would definitely not be an easy opponent. Rex obediently reported that he understood everything and immediately activated mana to destroy the dog. The people screamed even louder when they saw the art of mana, and now they were rooting for the knight even more. The knight using mana developed such speed that Kim did not even immediately react to the enemy's movement. All of Jean's previous opponents were weaklings compared to the way Rex moved. The knight attacked with precision and power, but Eugene was still able to dodge the blows. The hunter caught the moment that he needed to be even more careful with the apprentice, because if he missed it even a second he could die. Even in mortal danger, the mercenary still looked at Rex and his technicians with curiosity. The next moment Kim realized that a direct blow would be unavoidable and realized that the least he could do was at least block it. Jean crossed his arms in front of himself to withstand the blow of not only the fist but also the mana that was an extension of the knight. The hunter was thrown aside by the shock wave for now, but overall he was okay. When Eugene managed to get back on his feet, he heard Rex ask about the mercenary's name. The apprentice was ready to beat him again, but before that he decided to humiliate the hunter in revenge, telling him that although he had become famous in the demonic world, he remained the same wild beast, and added that now the bastard would regret that he had despised the saint. Claire and Jonathan couldn't believe that this evening would be the end for Kim, and the crowd only exaggerated the fact that the Crusher was a loser. The sorceress no longer knew how to react to the way Jean was behaving because she was both worried and angry at the same time. Raymond continued to silently watch the fight without interfering with either word or action. Rex threw Kim from one side of the arena to the other, and he didn't really resist the attacks. It was as if Eugene, on the contrary, wanted to feel as many blows from his opponent as possible, as if that was the idea. Raymond felt a strange feeling from the mercenary's behavior as he acted rather contradictorily. The saint watched as the fighter who had knocked out his previous opponents one after another now turned himself into a punching bag. For now, the knight could only suspect that the fighter's passivity was some kind of plan. At some point, Rex got tired of running around the arena and screaming, put all his strength into the next blow. A fist of mana flew towards Kim containing a clot of powerful energy, and this should have, if not killed then, certainly crippled the opponent. Jean parried the attack like a shuttlecock with a racket, and silence fell among the people again. The attack flew to the upper floor, and it immediately became a topic of discussion that the mercenary parried the mana's blow with his bare hands. Even Jonathan, who had seen a lot in his life, did not believe that it was possible to fight off the Holy Knight's mana with bare hands. The captain, almost losing his jaw, only now realized who he was dealing with, although he had already understood that he had not let an ordinary person into the team. Kim wiped the blood from his face and announced that he had finished assessing the apprentice's combat power, and that now he could test his strength. Jean hit the poor guy with the first blow so hard that he didn't even have time to react and cover himself. Rex coughed and couldn't really breathe from how strongly and suddenly he felt the savage's attack on himself. Raymond felt uneasy after seeing Rex's face after the simple blow. The saint was only able to reach the thought that frightened him the most, and that was that the hunter did not wait for the right moment to attack. Kim's face shone with pleasure and enjoyment from the battle process, which could only happen to crazy people. Eugene looked closely at the shocked Rex, who could not get up, and concluded that the blow was quite strong, but the guy was holding on, and asked if it was thanks to the mana that the fight was going easier for the young man. The guy sat on the floor unable to get up and looked into the eyes of a ferocious beast thirsting for blood. Kim asked the question directly, wondering how many more blows the saint's body could withstand. Raymond came down to the arena in time and covered Rex with his cloak, asking his opponent to stop, and announced his victory. The saint didn't like how it all ended, but he wasn't going to risk his assistant's life, so he told Jean that his condition would be fulfilled. The hunter was upset that he had just gotten into the swing of things and was let down like that, but he didn't actually respond. Jean was still pleased with himself because the plan worked out even better than he thought. People were shouting about how handsome the Skull Crusher was, and that they believed in him even though in reality they were complete liars. Meanwhile, in the mansion of the Golden Beetle Wolf, business was being carried out in pitch darkness. In a spacious room without any lighting sat Wolf's sons Derek and Cedric, greedily eating food and washing it all down with alcohol. Cedric, with his mouth full like a pig, indignantly asked his brother if they really had to wait 10 days to get behind the wall, and he answered in the same spirit that it was all the fault of the bastards from the Alliance of Order, who had already been given a lot of money and were unable to cope with a simple task. Derek supported his brother's dissatisfaction, saying that those bastards always work so carelessly because there is a lot of talk and no result. When Cedric asked if they should hold out until they could move on, his brother replied that they had no other choice. The appetite of the two people was brutal due to the fact that the brothers' backs resembled the cores of monsters. The situation with the brothers' bodies was critical and alarming, but for now it was only them who were worried. After all, Kim hadn't yet seen a living example of the transformation that Claire had warned about, and maybe after such a sight he would stop eating all sorts of junk.